Hello, my name is Paul Marchbanks, and this is Digging in the Dirt. With vinyl once again hip, the thrifting of retro clothing all the rage, and some youngsters deciding that audio cassettes and worn-out tapes of films are preferable to a pristine high-def image, it's a perfect moment to revisit a film you can only access online via a transfer that resembles a muddily digitized version of a poor VHS recording. Why, you ask, would I bother to examine a film that virtually no one has made a serious effort to preserve? Well, you see, Grand Isle, the 1991 version starring Kelly McGillis, not the 2019 action thriller headlined by Nicolas Cage, is a surprisingly faithful adaptation of the late 19th century American novel The Awakening, until it's not. I'm going to set you up to watch this film with what I hope is some helpful context. Over the last 3 decades, I've screened many film adaptations of assigned novels for modern students who are drawn to the color and kinesis of cinema, and their reactions are pretty memorable. They love pointing out the miscasting of actors, added dialogue that makes little sense given the source material, and the omission of key scenes. It is possible for a production to nail the transformation into film, but this is more rare than one might expect. The first time I taught Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice to high school seniors back in the fall of 1995, I showed clips of the incredibly faithful brand new miniseries starring Jennifer L. and Colin Firth, and my students ate it up. It's one of those unique adaptations that doesn't arrogantly attempt to improve on the original author's tone and dialogue. Literature lovers like myself owe much to Andrew Davies, the screenwriter for this and a host of successful adaptations of 19th century classics. The industry, however, rarely trusts such a story to win adequate box office on its own, and accordingly inserts sensual material absent from the original plot. It's as if most producers have never seen a film like Brief Encounter, A Patch of Blue, or In the Mood for Love. Films capable of conveying romantic tension without forcing the characters to shed their clothes. Sometimes a studio will provide advertisers with film stills that, having little bearing on the actual plot, bear quite a bit of flesh for a prospective audience. It's easier, however, to sell a film as sexy if it actually has sex in it. Then, when the marketing company you hire scours the final product looking for provocative footage they can weave into movie trailers and individual frames they can use in theatrical release posters, it's a snap. Let's consider just a few representative examples. The 2007 adaptation of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, directed by Patricia Rozema and produced by Harvey Weinstein's Miramax, decides that a general audience wants much more than a chaste suggestion of the romantic tension between straight-laced Fanny Price and her cousin Edmund, and much more than Austen's ambiguous allusion to an indiscretion between Henry and the married Maria. The book hedges on the precise nature of Henry's and Maria's connection prior to their later elopement, but the film allows the main character, Fanny, to find them naked in bed together. Deborah Warner's 1999 adaptation of Elizabeth Bowen's The Last September takes the 19-year-old Lois Farquhar's secret fascination with a married man, joins it to a brief and violent experience with an unnamed Irish rebel hiding in the countryside, and creates an entirely new, rather explicit encounter. In the film, the on-the-run member of the IRA has become a childhood friend of Lois, who offers her not the muzzle of a pistol, but her first sexual encounter. And in just a few months, we'll have Emerald Fennell's take on Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, a version starring Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie, which, if the the trailer is any indication, will do its best to sexualize a passion that, while quite obsessive in the novel, is rooted more in shared childhood trauma and camaraderie than the animal attraction that appears to dominate their relationship in this new adaptation. Should these and other elaborations of the intimate relations that naturally develop between lovers be simply celebrated, heralded, as evidence of greater verisimilitude in modern storytelling, a higher form of realism willing to reveal what prudes and Puritans would have us disguise? Is it instead possible that such content diminishes sophisticated storytelling by pandering to our libidos, presuming that dull minds lose interest without the occasional injection of titillation? Did you notice that all three of the directors I just listed are female? I wonder how many women in the business have decided that popular success requires replicating that objectifying look, what film critic Laura Mulvey called the heterosexual man's controlling and curious gaze back in 1975. Or should we instead assume that the open expression of sexuality by confident female characters on screen is intrinsically empowering? Towards which position do you incline? And does it matter who is behind as well as in front of the camera? Let's consider two women directing in Hollywood under the restrictions of the Motion Picture Production Code, or Hays Code, a set of self-imposed guidelines that discouraged those unabashed displays of sexuality we've become increasingly accustomed to since the code's demise in 1968. Dorothy Arzner rode the transition from silent films to talkies, and in the 1930s and early 40s was Hollywood's only female director. My favorite of her films is Dance Girl Dance from 1940, starring Lucille Ball in a scene-stealing role as a self-centered, successful burlesque dancer who adopts the stage name Tiger Lily. The other lead, played by Maureen O'Hara, temporarily buries her dreams of becoming a professional ballet dancer in order to pay the bills, instead playing a decorous, twirling stooge, an amusing foil to Tiger Lily's striptease act. In an extraordinary moment that nearly breaks the fourth wall, this Judy O'Brien interrupts a show to confront her hooting and hollering audience and calls them out for behavior the women in their personal lives would never tolerate. In this moment, Arzner speaks truth to a power backed up by public prejudice. It's a bold move that anticipates America Ferrera's powerful monologue in the Barbie movie. Ida Lupino followed Arzner in the late 40s, directing films for a few years before moving into TV direction in the mid-50s. Lupino was already a household name, having headlined films including They Drive by Night and High Sierra opposite Humphrey Bogart. Her name actually appears above Bogart's name on both movie posters, as well as crowd favorites like the original Roadhouse in 1948. When Lupino began directing, she immediately used her star power to fast-track films wrapped around difficult social issues, including Outrage in 1950, which considered the harrowing topic of rape without employing the trauma porn we too often find in today's films on the topic. She also stepped up to direct a film about the stigma surrounding pregnancy outside marriage in Not Wanted, and directed herself opposite Joan Fontaine in the aptly named The Bigamist. Arzner and Lupino demonstrated that serious, hard-hitting films can be made that critique the sexual objectification of women without inadvertently or purposefully performing the very kind of sexual objectification that one is supposedly denouncing. What, then, should we make of the 1991 adaptation of Kate Chopin's 1899 novel, The Awakening, produced by Kelly McGillis, directed by Mary Lambert, and based on a screenplay by Hesper Anderson, 5 years after she had helped write the screenplay for Children of a Lesser God. With women so thoroughly involved behind the camera, should we evaluate what we see in front of the camera differently? Much of what flickers across the screen in the film's first half seems lifted verbatim from the book, a decision on the part of the filmmakers that highly gratified this literature professor. The dialogue, settings, and period costumes, the careful ordering of scenes and appropriate nonverbal cues, pauses, and silences capture much of Edna Pontellier's slowly growing awareness at the late age of 28 of the various ways in which her married life is less than ideal. Léonce Pontellier's condescension, the casual treatment of his wife as another of his prized possessions, and his lack of concern when she explains the brief but intense fear that followed her exultation at swimming in the Gulf of Mexico, all on her own, all map directly onto the source material. There are a few subtle changes, however, many of which involve McGillis's appearance. To begin with, she smiles rather broadly in response to her husband a few times, and is quite maternal with her young boys, more so, I think, than is implied by the book. These brief effusions of pleasure around family members allow for a starker contrast when matters take a hard left turn later in the story. Kelly McGillis's version of Edna Pontellier seems more emotionally responsive to blood kin and much more emotionally and physically open when it comes to exploring romance outside of a marriage she finds stifling. McGillis, best known at the time for playing an attractive love interest opposite Harrison Ford in Witness and Tom Cruise in Top Gun, decides to put her entire body on display in this role where she ends up initiating intimacy as much as the men who find her desirable. McGillis's curvaceous figure diverges markedly from the description given in Chopin's novel, where the narrator notes, quote, "The charm of Edna Pontellier's physique stole insensibly on you. The lines of her body were long, clean, and symmetrical. It was a body which occasionally fell into splendid poses. There was no suggestion of the trim, stereotyped fashion plate about it. A casual and indiscriminating observer in passing might not cast a second glance upon the figure. But with more feeling and discernment, he would have recognized the noble beauty of its modeling and the graceful severity of poise and movement, which made Edna Pontellier different from the crowd." I wouldn't normally draw such attention to whether an actor precisely mirrors her or his description in a novel. In this case, however, Chopin makes a decided effort to not describe Edna as someone whose physique immediately captures the attentions of male passersby. The novelist wants readers to realize that her attractions are more internal, radiating outward in the way she carries herself, in the graceful severity of poise and movement which distinguish her from others. To instead suggest that various men gravitate towards her because she has Kelly McGillis's body type, a build even more noticeable without clothes, is to suggest once again that the viewing audience has no interest in subtlety, that we prefer brainless, erotic shortcuts to the more complex character interactions described by some of our canonical novelists. The filmmakers appear to assume that we lack the feeling and discernment necessary to recognize a specialness not writ large on Edna's body. At least, that's what I've concluded. Do you agree? Or do you think that the aesthetic demands and cultural expectations of our contemporary moment justify, require the sex and nudity the film adds to the original text? Does much hinge for you on the gender of the film's creators? Does knowing that McGillis, Lambert, and Anderson wielded creative control alter the calculus of critique? And what do you think of the other changes made to the story in the last half of the film? In the final analysis, does Grand Isle retain the spirit of Chopin's original, or Does the film betray whatever you consider to be the work's manifest intent? Please, point to features of the film I've not yet mentioned. What do you think?